Hello, 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 YouTubers. Biology 112 YouTubers, Dr. E here. We're on to chapter 23. Split it up because it's a long one. I've split it up into three sections: Part A, Part B, Part C. This, obviously, is Part A. So we're learning about paleobiology and macroevolution. So let's define terms just so you understand the title of the chapter. So paleobiology is just the study of ancient organisms. So that means we're going to see a lot of pictures of fossils because the best way to study ancient organisms is to look at their dead mineralized bodies. Macroevolution is evolution on a large scale over long periods of time. So whereas microevolution, which we learned in an earlier chapter, microevolution is small and relatively short term or short time frames of evolution. So new species forming, a genus splitting into two new species would be an example. Macroevolution would be evolution that's happening at the family level or before. So new families, new classes, new phyla, etc. Macroevolution is going to be, we're going to see big changes like whales being mammals that started out on land and then moved into the water, or dinosaurs that evolve into birds. So we're talking dead stuff and we're talking lots of changes. So we're kind of zoomed out here looking at some of the big trends in evolution. How do we know anything about the past? So it's easy to study living organisms, relatively. You go out and you catch them, and you can dissect them, and you can watch them as they court, or as they mate, or as they migrate. You can take account of their population size, or whatever. So studying living organisms is pretty easy. Studying ancient organisms is a little bit more challenging because we're limited by the specimens we have. We're looking at fossils. And what can a fossil tell us? Can it tell us anything about its behavior, or about its mating, or about its migration? So we're going to talk about what we can actually learn from fossils, right? So first up, with fossils, you're going to see some examples of fossils in a few slides, but just know that we can learn a lot from a fossil, believe it or not. So for one, we can learn the anatomy of the organism. So when you dig up a fossil, you're looking at its body parts. Maybe its beak, or its teeth, or its bones. Maybe you have skin imprint or imprints of feathers. We can learn a lot from this, right? And we don't even have to have the whole organism to learn a lot about it. So just a few bones can give us a lot of clues about how that organism lived. For example, if you find the right leg and the bones of the right leg, but the left leg is completely missing, you can infer that the left leg looked a lot like the right leg. So you don't even need all the parts to reconstruct an ancient organism. We can take some shortcuts. But anyway, to further illustrate that point, let's go back to what the book talks about. The book talks about dinosaurs and melanosomes. So did you know that there's lots of feathered dinosaurs in the fossil record? This is a relatively new discovery. So in the last 20 or 30 years, fossils coming out of China have revealed that there's lots and lots of dinosaurs with feathers. And the feathers that they have fall in lots of different feather categories. Some of these feathers, excuse me, some of these feathers were used for flight. So we'll talk about flying dinosaurs a little bit later. Some of these feathers were used for warmth. Some of these feathers were used for display. So in that last category, feathers used for display, think of a male peacock, right? He's got this huge train of feathers, big, beautiful feathers he uses to attract a mate. And so those feathers aren't used for flying. They're not used to keep him warm. They're used to attract the ladies. So dinosaurs, it turns out, some of their feathers were used for this same purpose. They were used for display. And using some scanning electron microscopes, which are very fancy microscopes, they have looked at some fossils of these feathered dinosaurs, and what they found was that they had melanosomes. Melanosomes are organelles inside of a cell that have pigments. And so a feather has a particular color because the cells of that feather are packed with melanosomes. So scientists have been able to look at these feather fossils from these ancient dinosaurs, like this guy over here, 150 million year old Anchiorhinus huxleyi. And what they found was that on its body, it had feathers that were gray or black. On its wings, it had feathers that were white and black, and on its head, it had feathers that were red. So that's pretty cool. By looking at melanosomes, we can see that this dinosaur had feathers of specific colors, and that gives credence to the hypothesis that these feathers at least were used for display. Other dinosaurs had iridescent feathers, so this is a starling, a bird that maybe you see flying around your window right now. And starlings have these shiny iridescent feathers, and so did some dinosaurs. So starlings look like some ancient dinosaurs. Why is that? Could birds be dinosaurs? Spoiler alert, yes. So in paleobiology, we're able to learn a lot from fossils. That's the point. All right, but what are fossils and where do they come from? Well, fossils come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. There's lots of different kinds. You'll see that in a second. But generally speaking, they're just dead things that got buried that didn't rot or get scavenged. Okay, so in other words, an organism at some point in the past was alive, and then it died. So it was killed by a flood or killed by a volcano, or it dropped dead from a broken heart, and then it turned into a fossil. How does that happen? Well, one way that it happens is through sedimentation. So as it rains, the water runs over the surface of the ground, and the rainwater picks up little bits of dirt and maybe dissolves little bits of rock, and then the rain runs into creeks, which run into rivers, which run into the ocean. And as the water runs into the creek or a lake or the ocean or whatever, it carries those sediments with it, and those sediments sink to the bottom. All right, so if an organism dies, let's say there's a dinosaur drinking water in the river and it falls over and it drowns and it sinks to the bottom of the river, and it lands on the bottom, and slowly it gets covered up by dirt. So that's sedimentation. So that dirt then over time becomes compressed, and eventually it'll dry out as it gets buried. And so the minerals in the dirt will exchange with the minerals in the dead organism's body, turning it to stone. And so a fossil is basically a stone that maintains the shape of the dead critter. We find fossils in different layers of rocks. Different layers of rocks are called strata. And you can see the strata here in Arizona. So each of these layers was deposited at a different time, with different types of minerals getting eroded and washing in, which is why you find different colors. And it's important to note too that the further down you go, the deeper you go, the further back in time you're going. So in other words, everyone will agree that the lowest strata got buried first, and then the layers above it got buried afterwards. So this is the most recent strata, and this is the oldest. So this allows us to do something called relative dating. I'll talk more about that in a minute, actually. Let's talk about fossilization some more. So fossilization is selective. What that means is not every organism that dies is going to turn into a fossil, and some organisms are more likely to turn into a fossil than others. So which types of organisms would be most likely to turn into a fossil? That's right. Good answer, Frank. A fossil is most likely going to be from an organism that dies and was trapped in something like water, dirt, ash, tree sap, tar, whatever. And so if you look at the examples in this picture, here we've got some petrified wood. This is a tree that died and fell over, probably was buried by a flood, and then it turned into stone. So this is basically a tree trunk that's turned into stone. This is like a type of, I don't know what that is, a plant, obviously, type of fern from the Carboniferous. So we find this in coal deposits. This is mosquitoes and amber. So amber is a type of stone that's formed from tree sap. So a tree weeps sap. The sap is really sticky. A mosquito lands on it, or another insect lands on it and gets stuck. And then the amber turns to stone, and the insect is stuck there forever. This is probably making you think of Jurassic Park, because if you remember in Jurassic Park, which, in case you didn't know, is fictional, they went and they found amber that had mosquitoes in it. The mosquitoes had dinosaur blood in their belly. and then they went in and they took the blood out and were able to sequence the genomes of the dinosaurs. Just random movie trivia. I can't help but talk about Jurassic Park. In the picture down here, this is a mammoth. And so this mammoth died in Siberia and was frozen and basically stayed frozen. So for thousands of years, it's been frozen in the permafrost of Siberia until these dudes went and dug it up. So you can see it's preserved. So this one didn't turn to stone. This one's just like a dehydrated baby mammoth. So anyway, the point is lots of different types of fossils. Sometimes they are impressions, sometimes they're casts, sometimes they're amber, or they're buried in volcanic ash, or they're frozen in ice or frozen soil, or they fall into a peat bog and they don't rot. So here's some more examples. This is a mollusk, so you can see, or a seashell, what you would call a seashell. This is the shell of a bivalve mollusk, so you can see the nice impression that it's left. You've already seen a petrified tree. Let's go to this guy. This is a fish that was buried in a lake, sank to the bottom, was covered in sediment, and turned into a fossil. What's notable about this one is you can see so much detail. So sometimes fossils get preserved in a really gentle way that allows you to see a lot of the details of their anatomy. And this is a coprolite, which is fancy talk for dinosaur poop. So sometimes dinosaurs would poop, and then the water or the poop would get buried in water and sediments, just like I talked about, and then the poop itself became a fossil. So what's nice is we can get we can see the bony structures or the shells of ancient organisms. We can look at plants. We can even count the rings on this petrified tree. Sometimes we can see a lot of detail. And we can learn about what dinosaurs were eating by studying their poop. There's actually a pretty big collector's market for dinosaur coprolites. You can spend a lot of coin on a rock that's dinosaur poop. Here's a cool example. This is a fossil site that's found in Nebraska called Ashfall Fossil Beds. And a few million years ago, actually I forget how long ago, I should have looked that up, 7 million years ago? I don't know, it's been a while. It's been a hot minute. And there was a hot spot. So this hot spot was in the northwestern region of North America. At the time, it was in southwest Idaho. It's since moved, and it's now under Yellowstone. We don't have time to talk about why that is, but just trust me on that. And at the time, this hot spot erupted as a volcano, and it spewed ash all over North America. And this ash would have fallen like rain for days or weeks. And it slowly buried everything. And all the way over here in Kansas, there was a savanna, and the ash fell down, and it was really hard to breathe. Everybody was sucking in ash into their lungs, which is not good. And it was really hot. And so they went to these watering holes to try to cool off, to get fresh water, to escape the ash. And they were slowly buried, and they died from various ailments. And then the ash fossilized them. So in this lower picture, you can see here's an ancient horse, and this is a tapir, I believe. And so the ash has preserved them in exquisite detail, and we can learn a lot about their anatomy and their behavior and about their ecosystem just from studying these fossils. All right, so there's lots of fossils that have been discovered, 300,000 species from millions of individual fossils discovered. And that's a pretty big number, but it's thought to be just a snapshot of the life that we've had here on Earth. So in other words, for every fossil species that we find, there's probably more than 99 more. Right? So we're only getting some organisms. Why are we only getting less than 1% of species that have been alive represented in the fossil record? And the answer is, or one answer is, not all species fossilize the same. So we talked about a dinosaur falling in the river and drowning. Right? So an organism is more likely to be fossilized if it's aquatic or if it lives near water, because water is a good way to create a fossil. So an animal living in the middle of the desert where it's hot and dry and it doesn't rain, when it dies, it's probably just going to rot away and decompose. So we find that the fossil record is biased. It's biased in the direction of aquatic organisms. It's also biased, well, hold up. So it's biased in terms of it, only certain habitats are represented, and some habitats more than others. It's biased in the form that it's mostly aquatic organisms that are represented. And then it's also biased in the sense that hard-shelled organisms or bony organisms are better represented. So jellyfish can be fossilized. We have fossils of jellyfish or imprints of jellyfish, but jellyfish are slimy and squishy. And although they're aquatic, so you think maybe they could get fossilized a lot, because they're so squishy, they don't get fossilized all that often. Mollusks like clams and snails and other hard-bodied aquatic critters, they like to bury themselves in the mud, burrow in the mud, and they are much more likely to be fossilized. So the bulk of species represented in the fossil record actually is hard-shelled mollusks. During the fossilization process, sometimes the animal is fossilized really gently and we can see a lot of detail. Here's a fish eating another fish, choked on it, tragically died, sank to the bottom, buried. Pretty cool. But that doesn't always happen. Sometimes these rock layers, since they're in the ground for millions of years, sometimes they get squished or crushed or heated up, and so sometimes they get deformed or even destroyed. So again, the fossil record is kind of a snapshot of some of the organisms that have been alive. We can go to places like the Grand Canyon. You can see all the strata represented here, and each strata has a different type of animal or plants and animals in it. So here you can see the lower layers. We've got some trilobites and some sea-dwelling fish. Well, and really all of these layers are different aquatic creatures. So we get snapshots of various past ecosystems. In this case, it's all oceans. So the Grand Canyon, for much of its history, it was under the ocean. Right? And then later it rose out of the ocean, and then the Colorado River carved out the canyon and exposed the strata, and now we can collect these fossils from dry land. All right, what about fossils and telling how old they are? Well, there's different ways to do that. So one way is relative dating. So here you just date the fossils relative to one another. So I mentioned before that the deeper strata are the oldest, so it's true also for fossils. So in this example I pulled off the web, these layers are older and these layers are younger. But notice that relative dating doesn't give you absolute times or dates. So it could be that these down here were formed last year and these were formed yesterday. We just don't know. We just know that these were formed prior to these. So to get more precise, to put actual numbers on the ages of these fossils, we use numerical dating or absolute dating. So in absolute dating, you are actually determining the age of a layer of rock or the age of a fossil. All right, and how do you do that? Well, there's lots of different techniques. Radiometric dating is one. In radiometric dating, a scientist can estimate the age of a rock by looking at how much a particular isotope has decayed to another element. So I don't need to get into the details here, but the idea is when some rocks form, there's these unstable isotopes that are trapped in that rock layer, and over time those isotopes decay and turn into other forms of elements. And so if we know how quickly they decay, then we can make an estimate as to how old that rock is. In other words, how long has it been since that layer first formed. If you look at the picture, you can see that we can't always date the layers that fossils are in. So if a fossil was formed in sedimentary rock, we can't use radiometric dating to do that, to date it, to age it. But we can use radiometric dating for other layers, like in this example, ash layers. So here, these fossils are below this ash layer and above this ash layer. And so when you go in and you do radiometric dating on the ash layers, maybe this one clocks in at 510 million years old, and this one clocks in at 495 million years old. And that makes sense because we know that this layer is older than this one. How old would these fossils be then? Well, not sure. They could be 510 million years old. Maybe they formed shortly after this layer. Or they could be 496 million years old. Maybe they formed right before this one. So the point is that radiometric dating of layers above and below fossil-bearing strata allow us to age the fossil-bearing strata, but not super precisely. So this is a span of about 15 million years. So we know these fossils, based on radiometric dating, fall into this range. So that's where we get, if you ever see a range on the age of a T-Rex or something, that's why it's a range and it's not more precise than that. I also wanted to mention that these techniques are used in archaeology all the time. So it's not just fossils that we're doing relative and absolute and radiometric dating on. If you've ever heard a news report of, they're digging a new canal somewhere and or a foundation for a new skyscraper, and they stumble across like a Roman road. What's going on there? Well, we are sitting on top of past human history. That's why archaeologists have to dig. And as you dig deeper, the further back in time you go. So then in this hypothetical example, here's the surface of the ground now, right? But as you dig below, you might find a medieval wall or medieval road. Before that, you might find a Roman road. Before that, you might find Iron Age artifacts. So we can date those relatively and then potentially radiometric dating or absolute dating as well. So the techniques are similar across archaeology and paleontology. And this is all about radiometric dating. Let's just skip it. All right, there's lots of different dating methods. So I compiled this table from a book, and which the name of the book escapes me at the moment. But the point here is you don't have to memorize this. Just know that there's different types of dating techniques for different age ranges. So in other words, let's start at the bottom and we'll work our way down, hitting some of the highlights. So we can use written records going back about 5,000 years. So we can say, okay, well, we found this piece of pottery, and this pottery has writing on it, and this in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, and so we can say that based on the writing, this pot is X many years old. So we can use human history to date some items, but since human history isn't that old compared to some of the things we want to study, we have to use other techniques. So in dendrochronology, we're looking at tree rings. So you can date, you can match up tree rings. So like if there's a good growing season, then you're going to get a thick ring. If it's a bad growing season, you're going to get a thin ring. So you get this pattern of rings. And so you can look at the pattern of rings in a living tree, and then in a tree that's dead, and then in a tree that's a fossil, or a tree that was even used like as a support beam in an Egyptian pyramid. So you can recreate this history and help date things simply by seeing where it fits on this tree ring timeline. Radiocarbon dating is good for 2 to about 50,000 years, 70,000 years. Is that right? Yeah, 70,000 years. So it's using the radioactive isotope carbon-14 as it decays into carbon-12. The point is it's good for like medium age stuff. So some human artifacts can be aged using radiocarbon dating. And then skipping to the bottom, really old stuff where we use more complicated techniques like a type of radiometric dating called potassium-argon and argon-to-argon dating. So this is 100,000 to multiple millions of years. So the point is when we age stuff, like we do in this example here, you need to use the right tool, and there are different tools that are best for different time frames. So in other words, you wouldn't want to date, a roller skate from the 1970s using potassium argon, but you might want to use written record, like made in China in 1975. Likewise, when you're studying an ash layer right below a layer of, in the Cambrian, when we first start seeing humans in the fossil record, you don't want to use dendrochronology because you can't go back that far, and you don't want to use radiocarbon dating because the layers are much older than 70,000 years, so you might want to use argon-argon dating. So by looking at all these different strata of rocks and fossils that are represented therein, scientists have reconstructed Earth's history. So the fossils kind of give these snapshots through time of different organisms that were alive. And they've used them to recreate or to structure the history of life, which we'll spend more time in upcoming lectures. And they're able to sort these different strata into different eras and periods and epochs. And so so you can see the general pattern of the history of life according to the fossil record. So the oldest fossils are bacteria, and then the oldest animal fossils are these weird marine critters that we'll talk about later. And then we get reptiles, and then we get amphibians, and then we get dinosaurs, and then eventually we get insects and mammals and flowering plants, and then here at the very end we get humans and their ancestors. So throughout the whole fossil record, we see a transition from simple and marine to complex and mammalian, and humans and their relatives show up pretty late on the evolutionary scene, or on the history of life scene. So we're talking last 7 million years for these bipedal, two-legged primates, including human ancestors. We can use fossils to recreate past ecosystems and landscapes. This is a cheesy image I pulled off the web, but it's worth noting that when we dig up fossils, it's also important where they are, right? And we can use these fossils and the rock layers they're in or around to recreate past ecosystems. So in North America during the Cretaceous, so about 70 million years ago, you can see that North America had this big inland sea. And this helps make sense of what we find in the fossils. So in this inland sea, we find a lot of aquatic critters like this ichthyosaur, this swimming reptile. So you can find ichthyosaur fossils here in Kansas. We find terrestrial dinosaurs like this Triceratops here in like British Columbia and Washington State. We find duck-billed dinosaurs on the eastern coast, which is different than the Triceratops we find here. So we find some dinosaur fossils here and some here, and the reason they're different is because they're living on these two different land masses that are split by this inland sea. So we got a little allopatric speciation going on. Yeah. So by looking at these fossils, scientists have reconstructed past ecosystems. So just here's a couple of highlights. So the earliest ecosystems, like when we first see some of the oldest animal fossils, all the fossils are marine critters and they're really weird. So the ocean 500 million years ago would have looked something like this. Imagine you're scuba diving 500 million years ago. These are some of the critters that you would see, and they're weird. They're really weird. See, there's not really very many, if any, modern species represented. These guys are all extinct. And so we still get fish, and we have fish today, but these fish are ancient fish with weird characteristics that we'll talk about later. We see arthropods like sea scorpions. So just, again, weird stuff. Later on in the Carboniferous, so about 330 million years ago, we get all these seedless vasculars and early gymnosperms and bryophytes and stuff. And we get weird critters like dragonflies with 6-foot wingspans and millipedes that are 8 feet long. Really weird stuff. And then in the Triassic or the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, so about, I don't know, 90 million years ago-ish, that's where we find dinosaur fossils and we find gymnosperms. This is a Jeep from Jurassic Park. I did this in my other class too. I forgot to erase this Jeep. This is Jurassic Park inspired. There were not Jeeps 90 million years ago, guys. And then this is, I don't know, maybe 50 million years ago. You can see these are mostly mammals, but they're weird mammals. The dinosaurs are gone. These are gone. The giant dragonflies are gone. The plants have shifted from seedless vasculars to angiosperms. So we see ecosystems like this showing up later. So this is just a couple of highlights of how we can see ecosystems change through the history of life on Earth. I mentioned before we can learn a lot about fossils by just being smart in how we study them. So we already talked about melanosomes and dinosaurs, and we can try to figure out like what sounds dinosaurs make, for example. So this is a Lambeosaurus, or Lambeosaurine, whatever. So a plant-eating dinosaur. And you can see that we've found skulls from these guys. And when they do x-rays or they look at the skulls or print these things with a 3D printer, they find that the skull has this weird nasal passage. It's got this crest going up and this nasal passage. So what did it use this for? There's been lots of ideas through the years. Maybe there was an opening here and these would feed underwater and they would use this as a snorkel so they could breathe through here. That was one idea for a while. But it turns out that that this elaborate nasal passage helped them communicate vocally. So they could use this nasal passage to make a honking sound or like a call. I was gonna make the sound. I have no idea what it sounded like, but scientists have been able to say, hey, they probably made sounds, and this nasal passage helped amplify it. And that is backed up, that hypothesis is given support by studying their ears. So by looking at their ear bones, they were able to learn that these same dinosaurs could hear low frequency sounds. So the honking was probably like a low honk or low, sound, and their ears were attuned to that particular frequency. We can learn about the food the dinosaurs ate by looking at their poop, like I talked about before. We can look for their stomach contents. So sometimes you find a fossil and you can look and see what their last meal was. Dinosaurs would eat stones. We find stones in their stomachs. Why would they do that? Well, it turns out, much like some modern birds that will swallow stones, they use the stones to help digest food. So the stones help crush and digest plants or seeds that they're eating. And so we can learn a lot about their diet. Footprints tell us how they walked. Do they walk on two legs? How long was the stride? How fast were they going? How much did they weigh? Pollen that we find in rocks lets us know what types of plants were around on the edge of the river or the edge of the lake. And then we can do clever things like look at stomata densities. So it turns out that plants will make stomata in proportion to how much CO2 is available. So if there's more CO2 available in the atmosphere, you've got high atmospheric CO2 concentrations, you don't need as many stomata. And so plants that lived during eras of Earth's history where there was a lot of CO2, they don't have as many stomata. And then as the CO2 levels dropped for various reasons, the plants would start making more stomata. And so even if we can't directly measure the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, we can use these stomatal densities in order to infer CO2 concentrations. Pretty clever. All right, we can also recreate Earth's past by studying things like plate tectonics and continental drift. So it turns out that the surface of the Earth, the crust of the Earth, is split into plates, and these plates kind of move around. So imagine the Earth is kind of like a puzzle. You guys know, like a jigsaw puzzle. You know what I'm talking about. But imagine these puzzle pieces were kind of moving. Like take your hand on the puzzle and shift it around. And those puzzle pieces, some of them might sink under other ones, or they might bump together. And that's what happens to Earth's crust. It consists of plates, which you can see here and here. And these plates move. They shift around. And this explains a lot of phenomena. So it explains, for example, earthquakes. So the North American plate is moving this way, and the Pacific plate is moving that way. And so as these plates move in opposite directions, it exerts a lot of friction, and then every now and then they slip. And when they slip, the ground shakes, and that's why we have earthquakes in California. This is also why we have mountains. So when two plates run into each other, it forms mountains. So for example, here's the Indian plate, and it's smashing up against the Eurasian plate. The Indian plate's moving this way, the Eurasian plate's moving that way, and they're smashing into each other, and the plates pile up a bunch of dirt where they're colliding, and that's how the Himalayan mountain range is forming. So mountain ranges are basically remnants of past collisions of plates. Even here in East Tennessee, the Appalachian Mountains were formed when the North American plate smashed into the African and Eurasian plates a long, long time ago. This leads to continental drift. It means that the continents of the Earth, they're typically on their own plate, right? So let's just look at North America. So where the places that are dry land, this plate is really thick and sticks out above the ocean. And places where there's ocean, the plate is thin and serves as a basin, and this fills up with rainwater, right? And then these entire plates where the continents rest shift and move around. So this means that the continents haven't always been where they are now, right? North America hasn't always been at this spot in the northern hemisphere. We'll see that in more detail in a second. India hasn't always been here connected to Asia. It used to be in this southern hemisphere. So continental drift is just talking about the movement of continents because of plate tectonics. All right, and when we reconstruct the past of these plates, we can trace Earth's history, and what we find is that there have been several supercontinents in the past. Most recently, the supercontinent of Pangaea, which existed in the Permian about 200 million years ago. So you can see here's North and South America, here's Africa, and here's Asia and Europe, here's India, Australia, and Antarctica. So South America and Africa were kind of spooning back in the day, and that's why they're the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa have the same shape. It's because they used to be together and they've been separating for 200 million years, right? And to talk about that separation, you can see how Pangaea split. So here the continents are moving away from each other, and you can see that initially they split into two supercontinents. So you get this continent of Laurasia above and Gondwana land on the bottom. And since then, the North America and South America have been moving west. India has been moving north. Antarctica has been moving south. And Australia has been moving east. All right. Now, these next 20 slides or so aren't in your version of the PowerPoint because you don't have to know this, but I wanted to show you just because it's so cool. So this is what the surface of the Earth looked like 540 million years ago. And MA means millions of years ago. Sometimes I have MA and sometimes I have MYA. It's the same thing. It's millions of years ago. And so 540 million years ago, you can see the North American plate was down here. So we were below the equator in the southern hemisphere. The arrow is pointing roughly at Tennessee, since I'm in Tennessee. All right. 40 million years later, you can see during the Ordovician that North America has moved upwards. You can see that there's less land, and that's because it's hotter, and the sea levels have risen. Somebody's honking their horn outside. Here we are 544 million years ago. Here's North America. Here's Tennessee. Tennessee's still underwater. So you can see here and here, Tennessee is underwater, and even a little bit here sometimes. But when Tennessee was underwater, this is when a lot of rocks were forming through sedimentation. So if you dig a hole in East Tennessee, you're going to find rocks that are from the Ordovician and Silurian, and other periods too, but the bulk of the rocks below our feet in East Tennessee were formed during this time. Here's the Devonian. There we are. The Carboniferous. So East Tennessee was kind of on the edge of this inland sea and the newly formed Appalachians. Permian. So here we're starting to see Pangaea form. So Tennessee's like kind of in the middle of this hot, dry supercontinent. Triassic, when we're starting to get our first dinosaurs. You can see it here. So we're finally in the northern hemisphere. Jurassic, so tons of dinosaurs. There we are, northern hemisphere. Pangaea is still breaking up. Cretaceous, remember that slide where I showed the inland sea? So this is from that same period. So we've got like this island over here with dinosaurs on it. These mountainous islands over here with dinosaurs on it. And then a big inland sea that's flush with fish and aquatic reptiles. And then in the Cenozoic, we get the Paleogene. So now North America, South America, everything's starting to look a little more recognizable. And then 23 million years ago, looking pretty familiar. We still have big deserts over places like Saudi Arabia. Hey, when I say Saudi Arabia, what do you think of? You think of oil. When did the oil form? Well, a lot of it probably formed when there were inland seas over what's now desert. All right, and here we are in the present. So, through Earth's history, things have changed a lot. The continents have moved around, the climate's changed, atmospheric composition has changed, And so here's a rough sketch of how some of these conditions have changed over the last 500 million years or so. So you can see that Earth has gone through periods of being warm and wet and cold and dry, kind of cycling back and forth, warm and wet, cold and dry, warm and wet, cold and dry. And sea level has changed. So when it was warm and wet, sea levels were higher, right? And when it was cold and dry, sea levels dropped because more water was locked up in ice. So this is explaining why, or explaining the changes of temperature and, and humidity over vast periods of Earth's history, and it's also showing changes in sea level. There's also some unpredictable events that changed the Earth and the organisms that lived on it. So we'll talk about two. One is the KT extinction event. So at the end of the Mesozoic, which I'll talk more about in just a minute, at the end of the dinosaur era, there was this huge asteroid that struck Chicxulub, Mexico. And so there's this huge crater right here, right, off this peninsula. And if you take samples from the rock under the ocean here, you see that there's this big scar from where this asteroid struck. Why do we care? Well, it turns out this asteroid hit about 66 million years ago. And 66 million years ago, most of the fossils that we find on land are dinosaurs. I mean, sure, we find reptiles and amphibians and some mammals and stuff, but dinosaurs ruled the earth up until, at 66 million years ago. And after 66 million years ago-ish, the dinosaurs go extinct and they disappear. Well, why did the dinosaurs go extinct? One idea is, the leading idea is, that this asteroid hit, it put up all sorts of debris and thermal energy into the atmosphere, and it rapidly changed the climate of the entire Earth. So global climate change on a broad level. And dinosaurs couldn't keep up. So the dinosaurs went extinct, not because some of them got vaporized by the impact of this asteroid, but the ones on the other side of the Earth may have gotten killed by the resulting climate change. Here's another geological process that's important. So it turns out that India, remember India is on its own plate and it's smashing against Asia right now. Well, India is a hotspot. It's where molten magma that's under the Earth kind of hits a thin part of the crust, and some of this hot magma leaks to the surface, and that's where volcanoes come from. And so as this hot magma leaks out, it forms basalt, which is a type of rock that forms from cooled lava. And so much of India, as you can see here in the part represented by the red, is rock layers that form from these erupting volcanoes. So they're called Deccan traps. I'm not sure why, but that's their name. It's the name of these huge millions of square miles of ancient volcanic lava eruptions. One interesting hypothesis, by the way, that I'll just mention because it's cool. These volcanoes in India were erupting about the same time as this asteroid hit. So there's been a few papers lately that talk about how maybe this asteroid impact here in Central America sent shock waves to the other side of the Earth. And on the other side of the Earth is this hot spot. So maybe the shock waves from that asteroid caused more of this volcano to erupt at a higher rate. And so it was like a 1-2 punch. The asteroid caused climate change, and these erupting volcanoes helped promote that climate change. And so maybe it was a 1-2 punch that took out the dinosaurs. I don't know, just kind of interesting. All right, when we look at the distribution of animals and plants, sometimes we see that they display what's called continuous distribution. So continuous distribution is species that live in suitable habitats throughout a geographical era. So in this picture, oh man, what is this? Is this not from the book? I think this was some bird, seagulls maybe. This is the distribution of seagulls. So you can see that some of them live in the south when they're not breeding, and then they migrate to these areas. They move further north to breed, and then they live in some sections year-round. So this is continuous distribution. In other words, it's not chopped up. We can say that these seagulls, even though they're around at different times of the year, they can be found from Louisiana all the way up to northern Canada. So this is continuous distribution. Contrast that with disjunct distribution. I have disjunction distribution. That should be disjunct distribution. And this is where closely related species live in widely separated locations. So let's just go to this example from the book. This is Nothofagus. This is a type of tree, type of, what is this thing, a fig tree? Type of tree, I don't know. And you can see that it's in South America and it's in New Zealand and some other places too. But why is it here and here? It's kind of weird. So this is not continuous variation. It doesn't look like this, right? This thing is found here and it's found here. Why is that? Well, one idea is that this is because a long time ago, right, when we go back to the Cretaceous, South America was close to Antarctica and New Zealand. So Nothofagus would have had a continuous distribution back then. However, as the continents moved around, the populations got split up. So these have been riding South America to the west, and these have been riding New Zealand to the east. And the reason we find them on these separate continents is because they've been riding the continents as the continents have shifted over millions of years. So that's why there's a disjunct distribution. Sometimes we see disjunct distributions because of dispersal. Dispersal is the movement of organisms away from their place of origin. So later I'm going to talk about horses. So horses evolved in North America and then they moved to Europe and Asia over land bridges, or primarily Asia and then Europe over land bridges. So that'd be an example of dispersal. Vicariance is the fragmentation of a once continuous geographical distribution by external factors. So vicariance would be the Nothofagus example, where they have a continuous distribution, and now they're disjunct because of vicariance, because these have been, their population has been fragmented as the continents have shifted in their location. As another example, I pulled this image off of a paper. Do I have the paper? Yeah, this paper. You can Google it if you want, if you're a nerd. And this paper talks about how these various birds that you see represented in the graphic, it's thought that they once displayed continuous variation. So 160 million years ago, the ancestors of these birds, much like Nothofagus, lived in South America and Antarctica and Australia. And then as the continents split up, they underwent vicariance. So the green ones live here because they rode South America that way, and the red ones live in New Zealand because they rode New Zealand to the east, and then the grayed out ones live in Africa because they've been chilling in Africa for 160 million years. So if this analysis is correct, they once displayed continuous variation, but now they have a disjunct distribution due to vicariance. So hopefully you understand all those fancy words I just used. But I will note that the paper goes on to say that this is incorrect, and based on molecular analysis, it's much more complicated. But anyway, we'll ignore that and just focus on what's probably a wrong idea, but it illustrates my point. All right, so when we look at the diversity of life on Earth, we can see that there are distinctive regional biotas. So a biota is all of the organisms living in a particular region. So a biota is going to have a particular flora, which is all the plants, and it's going to have a particular fauna. So here in Tennessee, our biota is, oak trees and maple trees and grasses and poison ivy and squirrels and deer and black bears, right? That's our biota. If you go to Australia, they've got a different biota. So there they have, I have no idea what plants they have, but they've got emus, well, they've got kangaroos, and koalas, and, oh man, I'm going blank on Australian animals, and platypi, and weird stuff. Oh my God. Sorry, it's been a long day. I've made like 10 videos today. So this map is showing some of the distinct biotas, some of the distinct biogeographical realms on Earth. In other words, these biotas live in particular places. So a biogeographical realm is a contiguous region that's occupied by animals with a shared evolutionary history. Right? So this is a biogeographical realm, and all the organisms here have been evolving together for a really long time. Australia is also a biogeographical realm, and its biota consists of animals that have been evolving together for a long time. Um, eh, shoot. So there are, I kind of messed up. There's 6 biogeographical realms, and those realms can get split up into zoogeographical realms. Actually, these are zoogeographical realms. Whatever, it's pretty much the same thing. You're looking at the geographic distributions of different species in order to see how they're similar due to shared evolutionary history. Some areas have endemic species. Endemic species are species that occur nowhere else on Earth. So the biota of Australia and its bio and zoogeographical realms consist of a lot of endemic species that you only find in Australia. Right? So endemic species typically have been evolving in one place for a really long period of time and have kind of been locked there. They haven't moved anywhere else. Right? Because if Australia didn't have endemic species, let's say that there were koalas all over Australia, all over Asia and Africa, then koalas wouldn't be endemic to Australia. Koalas would be endemic to Africa and Asia and Australia. But since koalas are endemic to Australia, we can say that the koalas have probably been trapped on Australia for a really long time. What we see we see some macroevolutionary trends. One of them is convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is the evolution of similar adaptations in distantly related organisms that occupy similar environments. That was a long one. Let me say it again. Convergent evolution is the evolution of similar adaptations in distantly related organisms that occupy similar environments. That sounds complicated, but it's not. Let me give you an example. So this is a cactus that you can find in North America, and these are spurges, which you can find in Africa. And if you look at them, they look really similar. So they're prickly, they don't have leaves, they undergo photosynthesis through their stems, and they have a similar style of photosynthesis called cam photosynthesis. And why do cacti and spurges look like this? The answer is convergent evolution. So they're both plants that are living in hot, dry areas, and those environmental conditions cause them to evolve in similar ways. And so the similar forms that we find in cacti and spurges is because of convergent evolution. They've kind of landed in the same place, but they got there through very different evolutionary paths. We can see something similar with mammals in continental drift. So as a setup for the next slide, here's North America, which has had mammals on it for, 70 million years or whatever. And then here's Australia. It's had mammals for that amount of time as well. But North America and Australia, they've been separated by a lot of distance for a long time. So the mammals here evolved in their own ways, and the mammals here evolved in their own ways. And what's fascinating is they've landed in some of the same places. So in North America, we've got flying squirrels, and in Australia, we've got honey gliders. In North America, there's a gray wolf, and Australia used to have a Tasmanian wolf. In North America, there's moles, and in Australia, there's moles. All of the mammals in North America are placental mammals, whereas all of the mammals in Australia are marsupials. Well, not all of them, but the bulk of them are marsupials. So placental mammals evolved in North America in all these different forms. Marsupial mammals evolved in Australia in all these different forms. And they occupied similar niches in the habitat and underwent convergent evolution. In other words, these flying squirrels evolved to become flying squirrels independently of how honey gliders evolved to become flying marsupial honey gliders in Australia. So we see a lot of parallels between the two mammals, but that's due to convergent evolution, mammals evolving into these different forms just as they are because they're evolving to take up different places in the habitat, in the ecosystem. We also find biogeographical evidence that, and what that means is we find that some animal groups and plant groups have been separated from others, and they've been evolving on their own terms for a long period of time. So let me just, I don't know if that made sense. Let me show you this. So this is called the Wallace line right here. So here is Southeast Asia, right? And here's Australia. And if you look at the plants and animals of Southeast Asia, they're of a particular type. You can find particular plants and animals. And if you look at the plants and animals of Australia, they're a particular type, and they're very different than the ones in Asia. And this line kind of has a mix of these two. So what's going on? Well, these plants and animals have been evolving in Australia for a long time. These plants and animals have been evolving in Asia for a long time. And because the continents are separated by distance and oceans, they didn't really mix. There wasn't a lot of gene flow. All right. And so, so this line separates these distinct biogeographical realms. Another example of that is the Great American Interchange. So, 3 to 3+ million years ago, you have mammals that were evolving in North America and mammals that were evolving in South America. Sea levels were higher and Panama was underwater. We talked about that a few videos ago. And so these guys couldn't go south very easily, and these guys couldn't go north very easily. So they evolved into different species. However, about 2.7 million years ago, the sea levels dropped. There was dry land here. And so a lot of these South American animals migrated into Central and North America. And a lot of these Northern and Central American mammals migrated south into South America. So about 2.7 million years ago, you get a bunch of South American mammals showing up in the fossil record up here, and you get a bunch, excuse me, you get a bunch of North American mammals showing up in the South American fossil record. All right, and so over time in the history of Earth, there's been a lot of shifts in biodiversity. So generally speaking, you can see this is tracking the number of families represented in the fossil record. So in the beginning of the history of life, there's only a few families represented, and now there's a lot. And what you'll see is that biodiversity, excuse me, I'm choking. Biodiversity is the number of species living on Earth, right, has changed over time. Generally, it's been getting larger. There's been more and more species represented in the fossil record, so biodiversity has been increasing. But there's also been these dips. So it's biodiversity has increased and then it dropped off. It increased and it dropped off. It increased or was kind of flat and then it dropped off. It increased and then it dropped off. So each of these drop-offs is a mass extinction event. And a mass extinction event, like we talked about with the asteroid and the Deccan traps, is an event that causes, for whatever reason, a large proportion of life on Earth to go extinct. So we see a drop in biodiversity after these mass extinction events. And we'll come back to that, pick up here with video part B.